That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Only Human. Today, we're going to finish up part 4 of a 4-part series on motivation. And before we get started into the topic of the day, which is finishing strong, I just want to do a brief recap of where we've come. Motivation is hugely important. We all know that. Nothing gets done without it. But it begins with some sort of inspiration. You know, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, that little spark that says, man, I wonder if this is something I ought to pursue. And then it grows into the initial stage of motivation where it's emotionally driven. Yeah, this sounds like something fun, something beneficial, something that would really help me or others. And so I'm going to continue this. Those two are pretty easy because they're driven by our emotions, and our emotions are natural drivers, right? So last week we got into the grind of it with perseverance, and we talked about how important it was to have resolve and overcome the obstacles and all those things. So now we're coming to close this whole thing up with this idea of finishing strong. So I want to begin like we always do, or mostly do, with the Blue Threat Proverb of the Week. And this week, it's Blue Threat Proverb 44, a brand new one. And it says, a strong finish doesn't just close the chapter, it defines the whole story. Right? And I think that's pretty apropos for what we want to talk about today. In the poster here, you can see further goes on to say that a strong finish transforms the struggle and the setbacks into proof of our resolve. And we've talked a lot about how important resolve is. The finish is the moment that turns the effort into legacy. It's something that's done, something that you're either proud of or just glad it's gone. And I believe that finishing strong is far more important to our personal and professional development than beginning strong. It's easy to start strong, but it's difficult to get through these final two steps, the perseverance and the strong finish, that really kind of defines who we are. So enough for the introduction here with the Blue Threat Proverb. There's a quote out there I think we've always heard, or many of us have heard, that says, you know, that last mile is always the hardest, or football metaphor, the last 10 yards is always the hardest. But it's definitely the one that sets true achievers and high-end professionals apart from the rest. I used to be a college professor at the Air Force Academy, history professor, so I read a lot of papers, right? We typically 2 or 3 fairly decent-sized papers per semester, and sometimes I had 100 students across 3 or 4 sections, and so that's a lot of reading to do. Almost all those kids were pretty good at writing coherent essays, but only a few of them really knew the secret of finishing strong. And there's some real inside mind games that go on when you're writing for a grade. And we're going to get to something called the peak end psychology here in a couple of minutes. But I had one kid, I'll never forget him, because he began every paper he ever wrote with a Shakespeare quote that applied somehow. And he finished every paper he ever wrote with some grand thought about, like, you know, well, I've proven that Napoleon wasn't a military genius, but was able to take what he had and do the most with it, I wonder what he would have done with a nuclear weapon. Now look what that kid just did to me. It's like, oh my gosh, this guy not only got the assignment, but he's thinking out into the future and how to apply this. And, what an incredible mind. And I would always have to force myself to go back and read those middle sections to see if he even did a great job at making his point. But he understood the power of influence of finishing strong. People will always remember somebody that's capable of finishing. And probably the most important person that's going to recognize that is ourselves, right? Nothing hangs over my head like unfinished projects, and we've talked about that before. And I don't think I'm alone in that regard. So today, I want to talk about some very specific tips, tools, techniques, ideas that I have and that I've been able to pull from research about how we can all finish just a little bit stronger, right? So let's get going. And the first section of this is, why does it matter, right? As long as the task is complete, old military phrase is an action passed is an action complete. Forget about it, move on. I think what's really important here that we can draw from the psychologists that study task management and things like that is this concept of what's called the peak end rule. PEAKEND rule, peak end rule. And what that says is that there are typically two things people will remember about something you did, or you will remember about something you did. And that is the peak experience during that task. And the second one is how it ends. It's a psychological principle that explains how things go into our long-term memory, right? And even though our brain is miraculous and it records everything that we've ever done, people simply don't have access to the entire duration of their experience. Right? Instead, they recall these two key moments. The peak, which is the most intense moment, either positive or negative, and then the end, how it all finished up. So I'll give you a couple examples here. A couple of years ago, I had my hip replaced. Pretty major surgery. I mean, they literally cut your leg off, the bone at least, and then they put a big rod in there and grind out the hip joint and all that stuff. And it was extremely painful prior to the surgery, which is why I had it. Only time I've ever been put under in my entire life. Only surgery I've ever had. I guess the only broken bone I've ever had, and they broke it for me. But the peak experience was in the diagnosis. I mean, you go in and you tell the guy, man, every once in a while I move in this direction, I get this searing pain to where, I mean, it immobilizes me. I can't move. I can't walk. And so the guy grabs your leg and he goes, tell me when that happens. I will never forget that, right? The next time I go in, I'm going to just tell the guy, trust me, it's really bad. Just change it, right? I only got one more to do if I ever have to do it. I hope I don't. So that peak memory, and you go for 4 or 5 visits, x-rays, all sorts of other stuff. But that memory of him grabbing my leg and moving it around until those nerves fired off, I will never, ever forget that, nor will I ever go through it again, I don't think. But all the rest of it, I don't remember going into the hospital. I don't remember the prep briefings. I don't remember any of that stuff. I remember coming out of anesthesia and this nurse looking down at me and saying, there he is. How are you feeling? And in the next 45 minutes to an hour, when I literally got up out of the bed and put weight on my leg, within 90 minutes to 2 hours after going through surgery and experiencing no pain for the first time in several years, I will never forget that. And, there was a lot of stuff that went on after that, rehabilitation and exercising and mobility things, all that stuff. But out of that whole experience, I remember those two things. And so when people ask me, should I get it done? I say, absolutely, it'll change your life. But then I always tell them about those two things. But that real positive ending left a pretty good taste in my mouth for that experience, right? So, that's one example. Let's think of a more common example, maybe, a customer service experience, right? We've all had some really bad ones. And occasionally, because we have so many routine bad ones, when we have a good one, it's memorable, right? And I was trying to find the right part for one of my four-wheel drive vehicles. And I got online. I thought I knew what it was called. I didn't know what it was called. I finally called the service desk, and I got a hold of somebody who, instead of saying, do you have a part number? Or, if you can't tell me exactly what the part is, I'm not going to be able to help you. He said, man, I feel you. Tell me where it is on the vehicle and kind of what it looks like, right? And so I was like, oh, this is kind of good. That was sort of the peak experience when this guy actually seemed like he wanted to help me find the right part. And as I described it, he hung on a couple of seconds, and then he said, look at your phone. I just sent you a picture. Does it look like this? And I go, that's it. He goes, okay, I'm going to send you the name of this in case you ever need it again, and we won't have to go through all of this. And he said, how can I help you place your order? And didn't send me anywhere else, took it all. 2 days later, this thing arrives in the UPS truck. I fixed my thing, and it was like incredible. And I remember that because it was so unexpected, that moment when I realized somebody was here to help me finish this task, right? So that's really important to remember when we think about finishing strong, is to look for that peak moment and realize that no matter what that is, you're going to have another memorable piece of whatever project, task, or goal you're on. And that's when you finish. So making the end of any experience positive, a project, a workout, right? It's going to leave a better lasting impression in your own mind, which is going to make you far more likely and willing to be able to start something new, right? Good thing just to keep in mind on all this stuff about being only human is that people remember highs and lows, right? So work on those, right? We don't remember the average feeling of any project, any task, whether it's a self-improvement task or whether we're helping somebody else. We remember the highs and lows, something to keep in mind. So with that, the next thing I want to talk about, and it harkens back to last week, is this idea of endurance or perseverance. As you approach the end of a task, it's really, really easy to get excited that it's going to be over, right? Back to my college teaching days, you could tell the kids that were just glad the project was over. They were the same ones that as soon as you assigned the paper, the first question they asked was, how long does it have to be, right? And my answer was, as long as necessary and probably no longer. And they said, no, I need to know number of pages or number of words. And sometimes I would have to give them that. But I tried not to, right? I would say things, look, I'm not going to measure the thickness of your paper. I'm not going to weigh it. I'm not going to look at the number of words. I've given you a task. I want you to achieve that task. So use as many words as you need to, but ideally not anymore. And that was really frustrating to those kids. They just hated me for that. But you could tell the ones that finished at midnight, right, and the ones that were smart enough to almost finish at midnight and decide, no, I'm going to really write the conclusion of this paper tomorrow morning when I'm rested, right? Enthusiasm to finish often combines with exhaustion, right? And we need to understand that, and we need to somehow break those things apart, right? Finishing strong is not only a measure of endurance, perseverance, what do we call it last week? Grit. Right? It's a measure of your intelligence. Can you decide for yourself not to push this thing across the finish line in a moment of exhaustion, but rather to commit to finishing strong, right? That will give you that peak experience of finishing that's going to put it in your mind that you are a finisher, you're a strong finisher, and you're building that habit pattern of finishing everything strong. So what gets in the way of us finishing strong? We already kind of brought up the first one, and that's fatigue or burnout, right? Maybe you start a project that you think is going to take you a couple of hours. We talk about working on cars a lot, and anytime I start to take something apart, in the back of my head, I think this is a 90-minute task if I've got the tools and the parts and everything right. But I'm also thinking when I get in there and look, something's going to go wrong, and I could turn this into an all-day event. So, what are the things that I'm going to need to button this up partially done if I have to? And that happens about half the time. You're getting in there, you're working on something, you didn't realize there's something else you have to do, or there's a tool you don't have, or you pull a bolt or a nut out and you wreck it on the way out, and now you've got to retap and re-die and all sorts of other things. And that's a metaphor for just about everything we do in life. So our motivation, our energy sort of naturally wane as we get closer to the finish line. And high mental fatigue, burnout on a project, I'm not talking about long-term like life burnout. I'm like, hey, I've worked on this enough, I just want to get it done. That creates a mindset of push it through, get it done, get it off your plate. There's a lot of training we talked before about procrastination that says, yeah, we should try to get things done and button them up by the end of the day. But when it's something important, something you've been working on for a while, I think it's better to leave it sit, come back with a fresh cup of coffee, a good night's sleep, and finish it as strong as you began it. So that's the first thing. Fatigue obviously gets in the way of us finishing strong. I think the second thing is we lose the original vision of why we were doing what we were doing, right? We kind of lose track of what we started to do, right? And that makes it harder to stay engaged with the why, right? And there's something tied to this, which is really a third thing, but I want to make it clear here. When we lose the vision of what we're trying to do, that can often happen when we expand the vision of what we're trying to do. Oh, I'm into this. I can also do that. And I can also do this. This is going to allow me to do this, this, and this. And so I should do them all right now. Okay? That's a pathway to oblivion on any project. When you set a project up, know what's required to finish it, and then finish it to those requirements. If you want a phase 2 or a phase 3 to that, that's fine. In the world I live in, where I create training and write books and things like that, if I do not do that, I am going to end up all over the place with 100 new things and never finishing strong on the one thing. And so it's super important, especially if you're a free thinker, as you progress through a project, to stay focused on that project. Go ahead and write some notes down somewhere else on the side that says, maybe I'll do this and maybe I'll do that. But right now, this is what's required to get this done. Closely related to that is this idea of perfection. We want to get as close to perfection as we can without letting it get in the way of finishing, right? I always like to say practice precision and picture perfection, but I would never have written a single article or a single book if I could not eventually say I'm done, right? I go back years and years and years and look at things I've written, and I'm embarrassed because I've gotten better at it. And I look at what my craft was at those points in time, and I say, oh my gosh, I should have spent more time on that. And I think that's a trap that a lot of people that want to do things really well can fall into. So there is a point, whether it's 95% perfect, 99% perfect, there is a true zone of good enough. And gosh, I hate to hear myself saying that, because those of you that have heard me out on the speaking tour over the years know that good enough, I like to say, is never good enough. You can never be good enough. But on a project, on a task, there is a point where it's good enough. And where you define that is up to you. And that's going to depend on resources, on time, on energy and motivation, right? But this idea of losing the original vision in two ways, either a bunch of branches and sequels, or saying, no, it's not good enough yet for me, and therefore I can't let go of it, right? Which brings us to our fourth real enemy of finishing strong, and that's fear of how it's going to be viewed by somebody else. What if I do all this and it doesn't work? What if it's not received well? What if I fail, right? So there's another side of that. What if it succeeds and now I've got to go do a whole bunch of other stuff around this? So as you start a project, it's really important to visualize the end game. And that end game is, I'm going to finish this and I'm going to be done with it, right? Maybe that vehicle won't start. Maybe it will. But I believe this is the plan, and this is my path to achieve the plan. And when I finish, we'll see how it ends up. But all those things, so burnout and fatigue, loss of original vision that can lead us to branches and sequels, or seeking, never letting go of the project and trying to make it better and better and better with no end. Excuse me. And then the final thing, which is fear of completion because it may succeed or it may fail. Hold on one second here. Thank you. So what can we do to overcome those obstacles? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we kind of just talked about them. Think of the end of whatever you're doing as the grand finale, man. The fireworks at the end of the show, the call to action at the end of the presentation, that stamp of excellence on your own work that shows you made a conscious and intentional effort across the whole project. Whatever that thing is, you're going to wrap it in a bow when you finish, right? So think grand finale on any project, any goal, anything that you're doing. If you think that way, that will reignite you toward the end when you're the most tired and you're the most fatigued. Second, try to avoid doing that when you're tired and fatigued. Third, reignite the why, your purpose for doing it, right? Why did you begin this? Think back to that inspiration, that early motivation. Think back to all of the perseverance that you had to put through. And that might just rekindle enough motivation for you to say, you know what? I put a lot of effort into this. I am going to finish it strong, right? For me, when I start a new project, and typically it's a major project, a book, a new line of training, some long-term fitness goal, I write down what I want to get out of it and what I expect to get out of it right at the very beginning. Because when I do that, I can't take my eyes off of the end game of the project I'm doing and why it's important to me, both personally or professionally. The last thing is, even though it's the end, it's not one task. There's probably some things you can still chop up and do a little bit, right? In my writing, I always try to make sure that at the very end, I tie back into everything that came before, right? So it looks like there was a reason for the content flow. I always try to make sure that the end is a joyful end. It's a call to action, but a positive one. And I always want to make sure that there's just a little bit of what comes next as based on what the book was all about. And that's either fiction or nonfiction. So those are three different things. And I can do one of them and get that done without worrying about finishing up at 5 o'clock or having to get up early the next morning or something like that. By setting these mini goals and knowing what they are ahead of time, I can make progress on a strong, complete finish, one step at a time. And, back to, James Clear's habit patterns, we've talked about 100 times, part of our behavioral strength. When you build a habit of breaking the finishing steps down into smaller things, then it becomes easier. Then you don't fear the ending because you have a process. You've got steps that you can go through. So, just set those little mini milestones to track your progress as you get ready to complete a task. I think the big thing for me, actually two things that are closely tied together. I like to celebrate progress. I've told you I've got, specific goals. I like to try to write 1,000 words a day. And, I get those 1,000 words done and I'm going to stop. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I'm going to have lunch or take a break, whatever it is. Because celebrating those mini milestones, they may have been 1,000 of the worst words I've ever written, but by golly, I got that one thing done. So create some sort of reward system along the way to celebrate your progress as you get ready to close something out. And then maybe the biggest one for me is visualizing that finish line. What's this going to look like? Right? What's that book going to look like? What's that course going to look like? What's it going to look like for when I slam the hood down and fire up the four-wheeler to take it for a ride? What's it going to sound like? What's it going to feel like when I know that I've completed this task, right? And that's just basic optimism and positive psychology there. Imagine that positive outcome, and that feeling will really increase the likelihood of achieving it. So kind of to wrap this whole thing together, finishing is not about managing your time. It's about managing your energy, right? It's about managing your energy. The reason I say don't finish late at night, finish early in the morning. The reason I say stop and break this thing into parts. The reason I say picture the end of it, visualize the end of it, is because there's energy that we naturally have inside us that comes from, nutrition, hydration, rest, all of that other stuff. And then there's energy that we can bring out of us through thinking positively and visualizing what this is going to look like and what it's going to feel like. So if you think about finishing anything, a task, a project, whatever it is, think about it in terms of energy management, right? Not time management. Because if you can manage your energy, you're going to optimize your time. I want to wrap this up by talking about motivation in kind of the big picture again. It is the driver of high performance. We've said for a long time that Only Human is about doing what you have with the resources at hand, with nobody that has to kick you in the butt, right? We grow because we know it's good to grow, and we have the capability to do it by ourselves and to ourselves, although we want help when we can get it. If we have this mindset that motivation is a driver toward that growth mindset that we talk about here all the time, then it's really critical that we understand how to manage all four sections of that, right? And we could break them down into more sections if we wanted to, but how to really fan the flames of that initial inspiration, how to build that early motivation that drives you towards some progress that you can celebrate to keep it going, how to persevere through those setbacks and those hurdles along the way. And then what we talked about here today, how to finish strong, right? How to finish strong. So let's see if we can finish this podcast strong, shall we? As an old airplane driver, used to have a statement that said, The flight's not complete until the last piece stops moving. And during the debrief for just about every flight I ever flew, especially with students, especially ones that landed at night, I'd say that, the flight's not complete till the last piece stops moving. And that last piece is when all of you get home safely tonight and into bed, right? So never forget that you just had a great flight. We're doing great things, but the most hazardous thing you're going to do all day is drive home when you're tired. So please pay attention and stay focused. That little habit, that little phraseology, I think refocused not only myself, but my entire team, right? To realize that the end is often not what we perceive to be the end, right? So I think as we wrap up the motivation series here, I'd like to ask you to do two things. Respond to me a little bit on things that work for you, tools and techniques. I used an awful lot of personal examples that probably don't resonate with a lot of you, but I'd like to hear from you on what does work for you. And before I go, I want to put out a little teaser for next week, which will either make or break this podcast for the next couple of years, probably. But next week, I'm going to talk about the presidential election in the United States. I think it'll at least bring some listeners in. I'm not going to give too much away, but it's going to lead us to a topic that's going to be really important in this season about knowing ourselves, and that is tribalism. How do we become part of some sort of movement, and what impact does it have on us as individuals, and what impact do we as individuals have on the movement of a group? So anyways, we're going to couch that all in the highly polarized, exciting period of time that we live in, and couch it with a case study on the U.S. presidential election that occurred last week here. So with that, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Every Tuesday, we drop at 9 o'clock Eastern. Please stay focused on what you can do to get better where you are with the resources at hand. And like always, we'll see you soon.